The three steps of the Canadian Federalism analysis are validity, applicability, and operability. The Canadian Constitution gives some powers to the federal government in Section 91 and gives others to the provinces in Section 92. I'm not going to list them all here, since you can just look them up yourself. To find out whether a law is valid under Canadian federalism, you have to pinpoint its pith and substance, and then see whether that pith and substance falls under one of the provincial or federal heads of power, which is what we call each of the specific powers allocated by the Constitution. We will dive deep on certain key heads of power in future videos. The pith and substance of a law is its dominant characteristic. According to R.V. Morgenthaler, 1993, there is no single test for pith and substance. The approach must be flexible. A technical, formalistic approach must be avoided. Nevertheless, the case gives us some non-exhaustive guidance as to what factors can weigh into our determination. First, the intended purpose of the law. This can often be deduced from preambles, purpose clauses, Hansard legislative history, and the policy inquiries and reports that informed the bill. Second, the legal effect of the law can be considered. How does the legislation change the law's state? Third, they consider the practical effect of the law. Note that the stated purpose of legislation isn't always the real purpose according to the court, so the government can't just squirm past federalism by lying about why they're passing a law or emphasizing one purpose at expense of another. Furthermore, pith and substance analysis must be totally separate from the art of classifying a matter into a head of power. The pith and substance of a statute isn't its head of power. Rather, it fits into a head of power at the next stage of the inquiry. Under the GGPPA reference at paragraph 52, it is stated that the pith and substance of a challenged statute or provision must be described as precisely as possible. The court seems to immediately undermine this, however, declaring in paragraph 53 that the pith and substance of a law can include the legislation's ends alone, or both its ends and means. In their own words, Parliament's or a provincial legislature's choice of means is not determinative of the legislation's true subject matter, although it may sometimes be permissible to consider the choice of means in defining a statute's purpose. So you can have fun with that. Once you have the pith and substance pinned down, you should define the scope of the potentially relevant heads of power. Each head of power is a class of laws, not a class of facts. Ideally, you should be able to see which head of power the pith and substance fits into. William R. Laderman's classification of laws and the British North America Act is a useful primer for this exercise. He concludes that, when trying to pick which head of power a given matter falls under, logic can show you the options, but won't always tell you which to pick. That a rule of law for purposes of the distribution of legislative powers is to be classified by the feature of its meaning, which is judged the most important one in that respect. The thesis so stated points to the heart of the problem of interpretation, i.e., whence come the criteria of relative importance necessary for such a decision. So, the court will probably end up taking account of the values found in the zeitgeist, or thinking about whether the feds or the province is best positioned to address the problem. They might also look to precedent, if they're in the mood to respect stare decisis. If it feels vibey to you, you're not alone. 3 key doctrines give the validity analysis additional flexibility. The first is the double aspect doctrine. Under the double aspect doctrine, a single subject matter can have both a federal and a provincial aspect at once, allowing for concurrent overlapping legislation from both levels of government concerning the matter. Prominent matters that are effectively subject to concurrent jurisdiction include bankruptcy, movies and videos, sexually explicit entertainment, child support, and custody. Just because the double aspect doctrine can apply does not mean that it should apply, as noted by Chief Justice Wagner at paragraph 128 of the GGPPA reference. According to him, it should be applied cautiously so as to avoid eroding the importance attached to the provincial autonomy in this court's jurisprudence. Multiple Access v. McCutcheon further clarifies that the double aspect doctrine is applicable when the contrast between the relative importance of the two features is not so sharp. If you'll permit me to go back to 1916, we can also cite Alberta v. Canada 1 AC 588 for some more detail on how and when to use the double aspect doctrine. The double aspect theory is neither an exception nor even a qualification to the rule of exclusive legislative jurisdiction. Its effect must not be to create concurrent fields of jurisdiction, in which Parliament and the legislatures may legislate on the same aspect. On the contrary, the double aspect theory can only be invoked when it gives effect to the rule of exclusive fields of jurisdiction. As its name indicates, it can only be applied in clear cases where the multiplicity of aspects is real and not merely nominal. The second is the doctrine of incidental effects. A law can have some impact on matters under the authority of another level of government, yet nevertheless remain valid. Quebec v. Lacombe, at paragraph 36, explains this well, so I'll quote it directly. The incidental effects rule applies when a provision in pith and substance lies within the competence of the enacting body but touches on a subject assigned to the other level of government. It holds that such a provision will not be invalid merely because it has an incidental effect on a legislative competence that falls beyond the jurisdiction of its enacting body. Successful invocations of the incidental effects doctrine can be seen in the Queen v. Klassen and in Murphy v. Canadian Pacific Railway 1958. The third is the ancillary powers doctrine. The ancillary powers doctrine is easy to mix up with the incidental effects doctrine, since they tend to apply in fairly similar situations, but they are not quite the same. Quoting from Lacombe again, the ancillary powers doctrine applies where a provision is, in pith and substance, outside the competence of its enacting body. The potentially invalid provision will be saved where it is an important part of a broader legislative scheme that is within the competence of the enacting body. Provisions deemed insufficiently integral to the scheme will be severed from the statute and struck down as unconstitutional, rather than being upheld under ancillary powers. General Motors of Canada Limited v. City National Leasing 1989 explains the test we apply. If the challenged provision doesn't intrude on the other government's powers, it's probably fine, unless the broader scheme itself is invalid. If the provision overflows onto the other government's powers marginally, it must be functionally related to the scheme's objectives if it is to be upheld. Lacombe gives us a more precise definition of functionally related, stating that it is not enough that the impugned measures supplement the legislative scheme, it must actively further it. If the provision amounts to serious overflow beyond the enacting government's powers, it must be truly necessary or integral to the valid statutory scheme to be upheld. So, that's the first step of the Canadian federalism analysis. Valid laws, however, can be ruled inapplicable under interjurisdictional immunity, or inoperable due to the federal paramountcy doctrine. We'll cover these now. Applicability is the second step of the Canadian federalism analysis, done after a law is found valid but before the federal paramountcy rule can be used. A law is inapplicable when it is blocked by interjurisdictional immunity, or IJI. Under IJI, provisions of a provincial law may be read down to avoid impairing core matters of the federal government's jurisdiction. The core of federal jurisdiction must be unfettered by provincial constraint. Applicability is tested before operability because, generally speaking, the court would prefer to read the provincial law narrowly to stop it from conflicting with the federal law, rather than acknowledging the conflict and applying the federal paramountcy override. Before we get into the IJI test itself, we should cover the general guiding principles that the court likes to use when examining questions of federalism. These are covered in the reference Repan Canada Securities Regulation, as well as Canadian Western Bank v. Alberta. The first principle is that of cooperative federalism. It dictates that we should try to read provincial and federal law in a manner that renders them compatible and harmonious with each other. We presume that the Parliament intends its laws to coexist with provincial laws, and the courts are thus bound to avoid imposing unnecessary constraints on provincial legislative action. But cooperative federalism cannot make ultra-virus things intra-virus and cannot impose limits on otherwise valid legislation. The court also seeks to balance diversity with unity, remain as predictable as they can, devolve things to the most local level possible under the subsidiarity principle, and interpret the heads of power in a way that reflects societal changes under the principle of progressiveness. So, with all that in the back of our minds, we can move on to the modern two-step test for IJI, which is laid out in Canadian Western Bank v. Alberta. Provincial law must not impair the exercise of a core element of federal jurisdiction. By core, they mean vital or essential, and by impair, they mean adversely impact or significantly intrude on. Mere effect does not constitute impairment. It's a fairly high bar. So, to block a provincial law's applicability using IJI, you'll first have to prove that applying the provincial law infringes on a federal core power, and then prove that the effect of the provincial law on that core federal power is so serious that it can be said to impair the federal exercise of it. As IJI undermines cooperative federalism and generates uncertainty, you should try not to use it except where established by precedent. One area where IJI has been used successfully is the regulation of airfields. In Quebec v. Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, the court found that forcing Parliament to specifically legislate to override the provincial law would constrain them seriously, especially when Parliament sought to establish a permissive regime, rather than the one they would have to micromanage. Accordingly, the feds won, and the challenged provincial restrictions on airfields were ruled inapplicable. The last step of the test is that of operability, or paramountcy. According to Sections 95 and 92(1) of the Constitution, agriculture, immigration, and interprovincial natural resource export are recognized areas of shared jurisdiction with federal supremacy. Pensions and supplementary benefits are shared as well, but with provincial supremacy under Section 94A. Otherwise, under the judge-made rule of federal paramountcy, provincial laws are inoperable insofar as they conflict with federal law. The operability test has 2 prongs, or debatably 3. If the feds can satisfy one prong, they will win the case without having to satisfy the other. Under the first prong, federal paramountcy renders provincial law inoperative when it is impossible for someone to comply with federal and provincial law at the same time. This could apply to a citizen trying to obey both laws at once, or a judge or government agent trying to apply both laws at once, and finding it impossible. For an example of the latter, see British Columbia v. Lafarge, Canada, paragraph 82. This prong is traditionally taught with the examples of multiple access v. McCutcheon and Ross v. Registrar of Motor Vehicles. These cases find that duplication is not contradiction, and neither is redundancy. A stricter provincial law, for instance, can coexist with a less strict federal law governing the same conduct. Murray Hall v. Quebec further clarifies that exemptions from federal prohibitions do not stop provinces from prohibiting the acts allowed by that exemption, or otherwise create any sort of positive right. See also Rothmans, Benson, and Hedges Inc. v. Saskatchewan, 2005. In Ross, a drunk driver was convicted under the Section 238 of the Federal Criminal Code for driving under the influence. The Criminal Code gives judges discretion to decide whether or not to suspend the guy's license and for how long, while the provincial law stipulated that anybody convicted of that offense have their license fully suspended for 3 months. The trial judge, using the discretion granted by the federal law, ordered that Ross not drive for 6 months except to and from work, but ordered that Ross's license not be suspended. The Ontario Registrar of Motor Vehicles decided to apply the 3-month absolute suspension anyways, as required by Section 21 of the Highway Traffic Act. Ross challenged the operability of Section 21, arguing that the mandatory suspension required by the HTA contradicted the criminal codes allowing judges to not suspend licenses if they don't want to. The SCC didn't buy it, since ultimately both laws can operate simultaneously. The federal law says the judge can impose suspensions if they like, and the provincial law stipulates that a suspension must be applied. Neither stops the other from being used, so the lower court should have applied both. The 3-month absolute suspension was upheld. As in McCutcheon, paramountcy does not kick in through the prong unless compliance with one law is defiance of the other. The second prong, established in Bank of Montreal v. Hall, 1990, at paragraphs 284 through 295, asks whether the provincial statute frustrates the federal statute's purpose or intent. According to Rothman's paragraph 21, Parliament cannot be said to have intended to exclude provincial laws unless there is very clear statutory language to that effect. The doctrine of paramountcy is to be applied in a modest, restrained way. For clarity's sake, we'll go over BMO v. Hall. Here, a farmer got a bank loan, using his equipment as security. He defaults and the bank takes his machines, as authorized by Federal Bank Act. The Provincial Limitations of Civil Rights Act says you have to give notice before seizing, and that failure to do so voids the debtor's obligations. The bank did not give such notice, and so the farmer sued to void his debts. According to the trial court, the Bank Act authorizes action without mentioning notice, so paramountcy says you don't need notice. The farmer loses. The appellate court disagreed. You are perfectly capable of exercising your Bank Act right without breaching the provincial law, since you can just give notice. Thus, they found no conflict, so the provincial law is operative and the farmer wins. The Supreme Court ended up siding with the bank, even though there was a possibility of dual compliance. To quote Justice Lafore, "The paramountcy question before me is thus reducible to asking whether there is an actual conflict in operation between the two laws, in the sense that the legislative purpose of Parliament stands to be displaced in the event that the appellate court is required to defer to the provincial legislation in order to realize on its security." In paragraph 236, she went on to consider what this purpose was. She found that the security interest and realization procedure must, in essence, be viewed as a single whole in that both components of the legislation are fully integral to Parliament's legislative purpose in creating this form of financing. The point of the federal statute was to create a uniform securities and seizure system across Canada, so letting provincial law interfere with the seizure rights granted therein would defeat the law's intended operation. The provincial law was therefore held inoperable. As put by Rothmans, Benson, and Hedges, Inc. v. Saskatchewan 2005, provincial legislation that displaces or frustrates Parliament's legislative purpose is also inconsistent for the purposes of the paramountcy doctrine. In this case, Section 19 of the Federal Tobacco Act bans tobacco ads, but Section 30 provides some exceptions. Saskatchewan's Tobacco Control Act, meanwhile, banned all tobacco ads wherever minors might see them, without exceptions. The Supreme Court held, in paragraph 18 of their opinion, that neither prong was satisfied and that paramountcy did not apply. Not only do federal exceptions fail to constitute an impossibility of dual compliance, but they are usually insufficient to establish a federal intent to exclude the province under the second prong. As the criminal law power is essentially prohibitory in character, provisions enacted pursuant to it do not ordinarily create freestanding rights that limit the ability of the provinces to legislate in the area more strictly than Parliament. Certain sources also refer to a third prong of the test, which states that provincial legislation is inoperative wherever a federal statute was intended to exclude provincial legislation from its subject area. According to Ross, federal legislation only occupies a field if it is clearly intended to do so. To quote from pages 15 and 16, citing ex parte Macleod, "It depends upon the intention of the paramount legislature to express by its enactment, completely, exhaustively, or exclusively, what shall be the law governing the particular conduct or matter to which its attention is directed." While some people would consider this as a third prong of the test, I'd lump this intention to occupy test in a sub-prong of the purpose frustration test. To me, it seems like it basically just asks us to figure out whether blocking out provincial legislation is a purpose of the federal law. When this is the case, then of course any provincial legislation in that area would be frustrating the federal statute's purpose. Since you can't meet the occupation test without also meeting the purpose test, I don't really think we need the occupation test at all, but you can categorize it in whatever manner helps your comprehension best. But if you want to avoid confusing yourself with non-difference distinctions, just say there are two prongs. So, there it is. Validity is when a law's pith and substance fits into a head of power belonging to the enacting government, subject to the doctrines of incidental effects, ancillary powers, and double aspects. The applicability of a provincial statute is constrained by the doctrine of interjurisdictional immunity, which narrows down provisions when they would impair a core federal power. The operability of a provincial statute is determined by whether the doctrine of paramountcy applies, and can be challenged based on an impossibility of dual compliance or the frustration of federal statutory intent. Ain't it a blast? I'll see you next time.